I'm delighted to be here on the HR Like a Boss live session. I understand this is the last one for the year, so no pressure on me, right? As you can see, I deal with pressure by having lots of fun. That's our kitchen table with our 4-year-old granddaughter who calls me Pops. So if you want to get my attention really fast today, just call me Pops. And yes, I have been certified as a Pops expert, right? Best Pops ever. So I don't think Sherm sent me that cup, but anyway, somebody did. So today I want to talk about with you something that is essential to creating a work positive culture. And Bridget, I don't know how I'm supposed to tell you to advance the slide, but now would be a good time, right? Okay. And that is how you can train your brain. Mindset really determines the positivity in a work culture. And we know from HBR studies and other places that have done extensive research into neuroscience and to the advantages of a positive work culture that the brain can be trained. We learned that from neuroscience. And it's an essential, and I would say, first step to your creation of a positive work culture is setting that mind. Your positive work culture, the extent to which your work culture grows people and profits in your company starts and stops with your head. So let's talk about how to train your brain today. And so I promise not to geek out on neuroscience. I am not a neuroscientist, nor am I even the son of a neuroscientist. But we are going to talk about some fun things today, as we'll see on the next slide, and that is about our reticular activating system. That's right. Your brain is set up for success because you have a RAS. Now, you may not have known you had a RAS. Actually, I'm not supposed to say your RAS, her RAS, his RAS, because you hear I'm from the South. And so things can come out a little differently there. So we want to say the RAS, the reticular activating system, is that part of your brain that is absolutely fascinating. It captures memories. And so if you want to think about your reticular activating system as the movie theater of your mind, all of the experiences that you've had previously come to play there in your work culture through your reticular activating system. So imagine all these people just on a team, much less 2,000 people, 70,000 people in a company, all bringing their reticular activating systems to work with them. So the movie that's playing in their mind, the mental movie, if you will, is comprised of characters from previous experiences with characters in the same company. Of course, families of origin play through our reticular activating system. So, really, the reticular activating system is that lens in your mind that we bring to how we view our current work culture. Now, the cool thing about it is, like movies, they can be edited. So, of course, there are producers and directors and screenwriters and all sorts of other people who put together movies. Same thing's on in your brain, only in nanoseconds it's happening, right? So you can augment your reticular activating system movie and change it. So what you want to do is, and I'm assuming most of us are HR leaders since this is HR Like a Boss Live, but if you happen to be a business owner and you're on with us today, your words matter and they weigh more than anybody else's words. So when you're giving leadership, paying attention to the words that you share in meetings and team meetings and company newsletters, any internal comms that you do, you might have a company podcast or something like that. The words weigh so much that come from you because they begin to activate certain portions of the mental movie that's playing in one's reticular activating system. So the cool thing for you is to know that you can help edit that reticular activating system. And we're going to talk about how some of that works today. So you have your reticular activating system, which you can program to focus on the positive. So as we move on to the next slide there, Bridget, we'll see that you literally can train your brain to focus on the positive. Now, the brain by default, and we can play the nature versus nurture conversation out at a different time, but your brain by default tends to focus on the negative. In fact, we all know, we've read, Ken Blanchard was the first one of my friends that exposed me to this thing. What does it take, like 7 to 12 compliments to overcome one negative, right, comment or thought or anything like that? So our brains by default go to the negative, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute and how to counteract that. But what you have an amazing opportunity to do as a leader is to train the brain to focus on the positive, to literally shine the light on those amazing things that are happening in companies. We know that that is has a ripple effect and accumulates when you begin to focus on the positive, because we know that, again, HBR studies have shown us that productivity goes up by 30%, operating income 19%, and revenue growth 28% year over year, when we literally are creating a what I like to call a work positive culture, a positive work culture. So we grow people and profits. Now, Dr. Joey, why the horses here? I learned the power of focusing on the positive and how long it takes us and what we go through in order to move from where our reticular activating systems movies are now to where we want them to be. My wife and I live on a small, just 22-acre horse farm in South Central Virginia. The Appalachian Mountains start in our backyard, as I was telling Bridget and Zaria and Jen earlier. We absolutely love living here, and we've been here for 25 years. Raised our two daughters here. We also boarded horses on our farm for other persons. And so a family of five came from South Dakota, traveled throughout the country. The dad's a welder, and so there was a prison that was going in, and he was the guy that welded the prison doors in place, right? So they had five horses, and they brought those five horses to us for boarding. So they toured our farm with us, and we said, hey, we were thinking that since you got five horses, we've got this 5-acre pasture. You can put your horses on this 5-acre pasture. And they turned and looked to us with these incredulous looks. Like, you remember the cartoon characters where their jaws dropped and their eyes bugged out big? That was kind of their reaction to us. They get the whole 5 acres, they said. And we're like, well, yeah, five horses, 5 acres, kind of the way we roll around here. So we were operating out of our own reticular activating system, our RAS, that this is the way horses need to be boarded and grazed. And we said, isn't that what you had in South Dakota? No, they said, our five horses were in a 100-foot by 100-foot paddock every single day. And do the math. That's not much space for a horse to even turn around in, much less have grass to graze and those kinds of things. So we said, yeah, they get the whole 5 acres. So they bring the horses from South Dakota. They want to be in this 5-acre pasture. So they back up the trailer, they lead the horses off. And I thought, just being ignorant, that the horses would just say, hey, this is amazing. We've been on this trailer too long. We were stuck in a 100-foot by 100-foot paddock for 2 years. It's great to be here in a 5-acre pasture. I thought they'd start romping around, eating grass, carrying on. You know what they did? Those five horses, we closed the gate. They stood right by the gate, just stood there. And I'm thinking there's something wrong with these horses. When they began walking, care to guess the perimeter that they walked? Yep, 100-foot by 100-foot area. And it went on day after day after day until around day 18, 19, 20, somewhere along in there, the alpha horse began to explore a little bit beyond 100 feet. I walk a couple of miles up and down our mile-long driveway, and so I get to see the horses in action. And I noticed that he was walking about 150 feet, then he'd go to 200 feet. And then on day 21, I had the pleasure of watching him turn around and look at the rest of the horses, their little herd there, look longingly out over that 5-acre pasture of lush green grass. And I mean, you can almost see his thought, his reticular activating system changing right there. What the heck? I'm going to try it. If I die, I die, because it's unknown. He doesn't know what he's marching out on. So he takes off running, runs to the far end of the pasture to the fence. He lived through that experience, and so he turned around and nickered to the other horses, who immediately began running all over the pasture. And from day 21 on, they were with us for a couple of years. They enjoyed every single blade of grass in all 5 acres. But they were locked in this mental prison. Their mental movie was 100-foot by 100-foot. That's some of what's going to happen with you as you begin to transform your work culture from whatever state of negativity or positivity it is now to really focusing on the positive. But you're just going to have to persevere and keep after it and understand that people's behavior doesn't change overnight, or just because you declare a certain set of values. You're going to need to work with them and coax them and move them through larger and larger areas of a mental map that they're afraid they're going to march off of. And so let's talk about some of those things that impact that way you train your brain and focus on the positive. So, Bridget, if you'll move on to our next slide for us, that'd be great. Yeah, this is, if I could give you one gift today, this would be the one simple question that you can ask these persons with whom you work and are on your team as you're seeking to transform from whatever state of negativity or positivity your culture is now to a more positive work culture. Train the brain with this one simple question. They're going to push back like the horses did. They're not going to trust it. They're just going to stand in one place. Okay, you declared these behaviors that support these values. We know that they make for a positive work culture, but so what? We don't trust them. This is just flash in the pan. It's just yet another initiative that's going to die and go away from here in 90 days. So we're not really going to change our behavior to go with it. So what you want to do is just ask this simple question. Okay, I get it. Other initiatives have been tried, they failed or just disappeared into thin air. But what if it were true? Immediately, you hear it, it just clicked in your brain. The reticular activating system begins to, kind of like Google Maps, recalculate, right? What if it were true? This question leverages that right on the top of that fulcrum that your brain is just looking for. And that is the transformation from negativity to positivity. So what if it were true? The innovation, the creativity begin to creep in. At first, it begins as a pin dot of light, right? And then you figure out it's not a train coming towards you, that it really is bringing more and more light. And it begins to open up a nice big new world, a whole 5-acre pasture, if you will. So make a note of that one question. What if it were true? Because you're going to get pushback as you try to train the brain and create this mindset that really makes for a positive work culture. So there's your simple question that we promised that attracted you to this today. So Bridget, if we'll move on to the next slide. After you ask what if it were true, you're going to have some people who really push back against that. Oh, it'll never be true, they say. There's no way it can be true. Or one of my favorite lines is something akin to, well, back in 1962, we tried something just like that. It didn't work then. It ain't going to work now. Right. People like that. Don't call their names though. Right. Right. Don't put their names in the chat or anything like that. I've given these people a special name because in a workshop with a company, I said, someone like this, someone who's just by nature negative and doesn't think anything's going to work. And a person actually yelled out another person's name. They were sitting on the other side of the room. And of course, I didn't know it. And the place went aghast. And so I'm like, okay, I got to come up with a name. So I call them Eeyore vampires. Eeyore, perhaps from the A.A. Milne series. I love it because I think the Winnie the Pooh books are really about teams at work. I mean, think about it for just a second. There's Winnie the Pooh, there's Piglet, there's my personal favorite, T.I. right? And what are they doing? They're planning the perfect play day for Christopher Robin. And so they're talking, and Rue's got his suggestions and fears, and they're all talking about these perfect play day activities. And who walks up but Eeyore, right? And what does Eeyore say? It'll never work. Or, oh, bother. Something like that. So we all work with an Eeyore, right? I mean, you've gotten in a team meeting and you've heard something like that remark I just offered up for your consideration a moment ago. There is that designated Eeyore. The problem with Eeyores at work is that they don't stay at work. Their reticular activating system is so negative and so contagious and pervasive that when the sun goes down, Eeyore morphs into a vampire and goes home with you. So just imagine you're with your family. Let's say I'm out on trail ride on a horse with our daughters or granddaughter, which is a lot of fun, by the way, or riding my tractor or sitting around a dinner table or having drinks with friends, just something that's really fun and cool to do. And who is circling in the back of your mind, right? Eeyore is morphed into a vampire and is sucking your attention because your brain's still trying to solve that problem that the Eeyore presented. Energy. Aren't you just exhausted? I mean, you can barely drag yourself across the threshold to get in the back door, right? Because Eeyore vampires are exhausting. So time, you can't get that time back because you're not being in the present moment. So let me just give you 3 quick tips on how you can deal with conversations, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's around a water cooler or a coffee pot or wherever you find yourself, right? Teams, whatever. Here are 3 quick tips for how you can deal with negative people like an Eeyore vampire without becoming one yourself. And I prefer to think about it as a conversation polarity transformation. We're going to take the conversation, move it from negative to positive. And this is, again, a part of your reticular activating system has those scenes in it in which you've dealt with ER vampires before. So let's train your brain to be in that conversation for just a moment. Let's say the ER vampire is talking about the boss or the owner of the company. Let's say his name's Dr. Joey. That Dr. Joey, he shouldn't be a leader. He doesn't know what he's doing. He couldn't manage his way out of a wet paper bag if he tried. Give him the directions and he can't do it. Okay, so you walk up and you hear that conversation. Tactic one is to redirect that conversation. In other words, take a quick hit on it and go from negative to positive. Hey, man, it was such a beautiful weekend. My family and I got out on the lake. Did anybody else get outdoors and have some fun during the weekend in that beautiful weather? You see what that does? It's like you're just trying to suck all the air out of the conversation that the Eeyore vampire is consuming, suffocate him, and move on to something more positive. Eeyore vampires have an amazing ability to be persistent, though, don't they? I mean, they just keep going. They're worse than Energizer bunnies, right? I'm mixing my metaphors, but they just keep going and going and going. So let's say if the Eeyore vampire just gives you the side eye and goes right on back to talking about Dr. Joey and what a sorry business owner he is, then reframe the conversation. That is, stay on that topic of Dr. Joey, but just shift the polarity enough to where you move the subject perspective from negative to positive. So you could say something like, well, Dr. Joey could stand some improvement as a leader. I get that. But the last time I checked my bank account, all those deposits he's making, all of them have cleared. So he's putting groceries on my table and gas in my tank. He's kind of my hero. You see, you're still on the same subject of Dr. Joey and his leadership or lack thereof, right? But yet you've changed the polarity of that particular subject. Now, again, ER vampires, man, they keep charging up the hills over and over and over. So let's say you tried to redirect it. That is a complete switch from negative to positive, changing the subject. Let's say you reframed it, you stayed on the subject, but you sought to change the polarity from negative to positive. Neither of those work. ER vampires charging up the hill. Oh, bother. It just keeps going and going and going. Remove yourself from that conversation, because what's happening is your reticular activating system's movie is being produced and directed by that Eeyore vampire in that moment, and will, again, after dark, continue to consume your mental capacity. You don't want to waste your brain on that. Don't rent space in your head to an Eeyore vampire, because they don't choose to get any better. Remove yourself from that contagion, because just like a vampire bite, it's a contagion. It invades cultures. So these are tactics that I want you to try for yourself, but I also want you to teach your team members as well. You don't have to sit there and take it. If the conversation is not going away, mute yourself, close your speakers down on Zoom, something until the meeting starts. Just take yourself out of that conversation so that it's not producing and directing the movie that's in your head. So that's the train your brain conversation, polarity transformation, 3 quick tactics that you can take. So, Bridget, let's go on and talk about another aspect of creating a positive work culture. If you're going to suffocate or take the air out of conversations about you or vampires, what will you talk about? So let me give you something to talk about. Here are 3 things. First, culture KPIs. Companies typically have, although I'm overwhelmed by those that don't oftentimes. Companies typically have KPIs. We set goals for our sales team, for production, things like this. Whatever industry you're in, there typically some kind of key performance indicators, at least hopefully at your company there. I'd like to suggest that you, rather than just having mission, vision, and value statements, that you begin to look at culture KPIs. And I like to call them culture KPIs because that distinguishes them from our typical KPIs. Culture KPIs are behavior driven. It's not just we're honest, that's one of our core values. What does it look like when we're honest around here? We share feedback authentically, some kind of culture KPIs. Now, it sits in the space for leadership to give definition to these behaviors, but in order for them to be pervasive throughout the company, and we have something to talk about other than what Eeyore vampires want to talk about to shape our mental models, right? Our RAS movies, and focus on the positive. Those culture KPIs need to be communicated. Sometimes it's like choosing the next pope when you choose values, right? The leadership team goes off and then three puffs of smoke, and then all of a sudden you've got, right? Mission, vision, and values. Culture KPIs can be the same way. In order for them to be effective, and by effective, I mean changing behavior, transforming behaviors so that our work culture becomes more positive, we've got to communicate them. Now, let me encourage you to communicate them in ways that you're already communicating. A lot of the companies that we work with, we encourage them to open up every meeting by taking 5 minutes to talk about a culture KPI and what it means to us. What's been your experience with this? When did you catch someone sharing feedback authentically and being honest about it? When did you find someone being positive and supportive of someone else in their workspace? When did you see someone with exceptional customer service? So those natural kind of places where you're already communicating in meetings, if your internal comms produces a newsletter for you, something like that, wherever you whatever the touch points are, all of which, by the way, help produce and direct that reticular activating system movie of what it looks like for us to have a positive work culture around here. Use those organs that are already being used, communicate through those. Now, Dr. Joe, we really don't have a lot of those. We don't have too many. Then choose a cadence, choose how the conversations that your people are already having, whether it's through Slack or whatever, choose the cadence into which you'll talk about these culture KPIs. Do we want to talk about them in every newsletter, every other newsletter, once a month in our newsletter, once a quarter? How's it going to be? Do we want to talk about them in every Monday meeting or every other Monday meeting or whatever day of the week that you meet? What's the cadence? So if we're moving from negative conversations to positive conversations, we want to fill that vacuum because it'll go right back to the previous with the negativity, right? We want to fill it with positivity. So let's talk about culture KPIs, what those behaviors are that build out our positive work culture and create that, foster that, facilitate that on a daily basis. How can we continue to communicate those because it's so important? Consistency is important. And then what's the cadence that we'll use to communicate those culture KPIs on enough of a regular basis to impact the focus on the positive? Because again, like those 5 horses, we're going to stand in one spot. And just because we announce culture KPIs does not mean our behavior is going to begin to change. But we begin to trust into it and lean into it and go out to 120 feet, 150 feet. And then pretty soon we're walking all over the 5-acre pasture, the green field, if you will, of a positive work culture when we focus on culture KPIs and communication cadence. So there's something to talk about when the Eeyore vampires are suffocated. So Bridget, we'll move on to our next slide here so that we can, when we're communicating whatever cadence we want to in these culture KPIs, choose one culture KPI at a time. Now, why is that? Jim Collins has sold a whole lot more books than I have, and I suspect we've all read From Good to Great. And in there, he talks about setting BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. And so, there's this encouragement for everybody to be what I call a BHAGger, someone who does BHAGs. We need BHAGgers in our companies, on our teams, and I'm all in favor of big, hairy, audacious goals. However, most of us, if not virtually all of us, are not behaggers. It scares us. And anytime you're trying to, the fears erupt in our reticular activating system movie, right? Anytime you're trying to transform something, anything culturally, particularly when you're going from negative to positive, fear, and I write in my Work Positive in a Negative World Team Edition book about the 5 fears that we typically face. If I can focus on one thing to do, I can take that one step, right, to create a positive work culture. That way I'm not overwhelmed. You don't trigger my limbic system in my brain. I call it the caveman, cavewoman brain that, fight or flight. That's what we typically call it. So these 3 questions help you identify that one thing. And you can take these right into your management meeting, right into your team meetings, whatever that culture KPI is that you're focusing on at that time, right? Let's say, we're going back to that honesty. We're looking at being honest. What does that look like when we're being honest? Well, we give feedback authentically. Okay. So, where are we as a team on giving authentic feedback? When have you seen someone give authentic feedback? Okay. When have you seen someone give inauthentic feedback? Okay. Of course, that's a trick question, right? Because if they're not giving any feedback, I guess that's inauthentic too. So that's the first question. Where are we? And then the second question is, where do we want to be? So here we're talking about that culture KPI of giving authentic feedback. What does that look like? When have you experienced it? It could be here or someplace else. And so here's where we are. Was it Max Dupree and the Leadership Jazz talked about one of the first things a leader must do is declare reality. Where are we? Here's where we are in this culture KPI. Where do we want to be in that culture KPI? Now, the gap is what we want to span, but we are tempted to try to jump that gap all at once. That's where the overwhelm and the fear comes in. That's where the pushback comes in. That's why Eeyore vampires exist, because they've been asked to span gaps mentally and behaviorally that they just knew they couldn't overcome. So they've deferred, and it's easier to criticize and accuse than it is to actually try to span the gap. Your role as a leader of in transforming a positive work culture is to say, what's our next best action? What's the one thing we can do? Do one thing, right? I've got my second book in that Do One Thing series coming out in next month. What's one thing we can do that's our next best action? We know we want to get over here. We know here's where we are. What's one thing we can do to move forward? Now, it's vitally important that you act like Google Maps right here. I go places. I don't know how I got anywhere without Google Maps. And by the way, I'm not making anything off Google Maps here. Well, I literally don't know how I got anywhere before Google Maps, because now I just, I don't even have to think. I'm just jamming out to my music, and then they tell me to turn here and here and here and here, and I'm good to go. Well, I have yet to experience Google Maps when I miss a turn. I have yet to experience Google Maps say something to me like, "Fool, I told you to turn right there. Why'd you miss the turn?" No. What does Google Maps do? Yeah, recalculating, right? The old Garmin GPS has said recalculating. Google Maps doesn't say anything. It just recalculates and then encourages you to make a turn. There needs to be like this forgiveness culture base as you're trying to get from where you are to where you want to be in these culture KPIs. Because remember, the reticular activating system has that movie playing just like those horses did. And those people are not going to go from negative to positive just because you want them to, or just because you encourage to, or say, "Come on, can't you see what I see?" No, it's our next best action. How did that go? What did we learn from it? How do we move forward? So we just simply recalculate so it's in a zigzag motion to get from where we are to where we want to be. And that happens one thing at a time. So we want to do one thing, take an action, reflect on it, learn from it, bounce forward. Or as Dr. Sean Aker talks about in the happiness advantage, we fall forward, right? which is an amazing activity. So that's how you train your brain to get from where you are to where you want to be, just focusing in on one thing to do to take that next best action. So let's look at something else we can do, Bridget, as we advance to the next slide here. What we're talking about here is a basic process, and I don't have time to give you full ICF explanation for coaching. A lot of people throw around the word coach today. ICF has the gold standard definitions for coaching in their 8 core competencies. I am a trained ICF certified coach at the PCC level. Our company does level 1 training for ICF coaches. So what we like to see here is not so much coaching for coaching's sake, not so much just culture for culture's sake, but coaching for culture using this process, coaching for a positive culture, which means we've got a framework. We understand what it looks like to have a positive work culture here, because we do want to grow our productivity by 30%, our operating income by 19%, our revenue by 28% year over year over year. So we're getting better and better and better every year, and we're growing more people and more profits every year. So these 3 A's really comprise coaching for culture. And this is just a quick and dirty hit on how we like to roll and help you transform your work culture. First of all, you got to raise new awareness around it. That is, the reticular activating system is locked and loaded on that certain mental mindset, that movie that's playing. So in order for you to have some editing going on of that movie by your team members, asking powerful questions like, what if it were true, causes that new awareness to bubble up from within them. They are far more likely to do that KPI, that culture KPI, that new behavior, if they see it and adopt it as their own. Motivation is an inside job. You get to stimulate or manipulate. You can only manipulate for so long. You can stimulate with powerful questions. And so as that new awareness of what would it look like for our team at the Acme Corporation to work positive? What might that look like? What would it look like for us to uh, give feedback authentically? And therein lies the internal conversation that begins spilling over, and the collective, the team RAS movie then, because of that new awareness, begins to edit right before your very eyes. Now, it's amazing to have that new RAS movie, but we've got to see ourselves in the movie as a character in a plot line that develops towards a positive work culture. So we also, in Coaching for Culture, help choose an action. And I'm back to those 3 questions I asked a moment ago. Where are we? Where do we want to be? What's our next best action? It counts. That new awareness counts. It becomes real when you take action on it. Of course, awareness and action require accountability. Now, my definition of accountability might be a little different than yours. I define accountability as putting just enough pressure on myself or just enough pressure on someone else as an accountability partner to help bring out the best in them. Because remember the horses? At first, they stepped out a few feet, a few feet, a few feet, until eventually they began to trust. This new awareness does not equal immediate trust. It's an awareness. As I act on it, again, in that zigzag fashion, right? I'm learning, I'm growing, and growth always lies just beyond the edge of my comfort zone. So you're asking me to move out beyond 100 feet. And when a horse, despite its size, thinks that the whole world's out to eat it, right? And to kill it. So that's why it moves very, very slowly, a few feet at a time. Action brings more action. Success begets success. So, in terms of accountability, putting just enough pressure to keep the action going, to reinforcing that new awareness. And neuroscientists will tell you it takes at least 21 days to start a new habit, right? So, again, a lot of grace, but accountability there. Let's work together as a team on continuing to edit the movie that's playing in our collective experience, the team RAS. Let's take action together, move forward, celebrate the wins, learn from the woes, and together we put just enough pressure on each other to bring out the best in each other, which is the antithesis of an Eeyore vampire, right? But we're creating a positive work culture. in which, again, productivity goes up 30%, operating income 19%, and revenue growth 28%. So we're growing people and profits. That's how we create a sustainable, positive work culture through coaching for culture. So we'll move on to the next slide, Bridget, please. And here you get to decide what to do now that you've heard this presentation. What is it you would like to do because you spent your lunchtime or a few minutes with us today? Now what's always a great question. Indeed, when you focus on the positive, you see what you choose to see. And yet I know some of you listening here, okay, sure, it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, not really going to work. So with you, it's probably DOA, dead on arrival. I got my SHRM, my HRCI credit, good to go, glad for that. Boom, there I am off to the races to go back and do what I've been doing all along. I got to ask you, how's that increasing productivity, operating income, and revenue growth? How's that growing people and profits? It's your choice. I'm just asking the question. Second choice that you've got right now is to try to do it yourself. Okay, Dr. Joey, man, I got some tips here. I got some great questions going in that if it were true question, man, that's a really good question. Let me just go try asking that question and see what I can get done by myself. Hey, I understand you're a highly gifted, highly motivated person, or else you wouldn't be here on this webinar, right? You're constantly looking to learn and grow. Well, I'm just here to tell you from my experience, having made a bazillion mistakes, oftentimes in a single week, you can learn by being in a mentoring community like this one, or some other community in which you find yourself, a mastermind group or something like that, where you're learning from other people so that you can avoid some of the mistakes that other people have made and can learn from them. So, hey, I'm all about DIYing. My wife and I are painting our apartment, getting it ready for the next travel nurse to rent. However, sometimes it's better to go with a group than it is to try to DIY stuff yourself. The third option you've got after this webinar today, in response to this now what question, is do one thing. What's one thing that you can do today to just begin taking those next best actions, that next best step to creating a positive work culture? Who can you take with you in doing this one thing? Who can you challenge? Who can you invite to do one thing with you? Who can you take the replay of this recording to say, hey, watch this, and then let's have a conversation about it? How can you do one thing that will begin this process of transforming from negative to positive work culture so that you truly are growing people and profits as you work positive? So what's your one thing? I'd love for you to share your one thing with me. Bridget, if you'll go to the next slide, my email address is right here on this next slide. You'll see it there, Dr. Joey at workpositive.today. That's Dr. Joey at workpositive.today. And hey, man, if I love you or do one thing, I might invite you to the round table by the fireplace in our farmhouse, and we could sit and talk about one things to do. Although I got to warn you, the granddaughter there, she's 4.5 now, and she's kind of like Pops. She likes to talk a lot, so she might dominate our conversation. However, we can talk about how you can HR like a boss and truly create a positive work culture by focusing on the reticular activating system and editing that and producing and directing the best work culture movie possible for your team and your company.